A castle does not become haunted because people die inside it. Sometimes it becomes haunted because the living refuse to let warmth return. Clara Bennett remembered those words as the carriage climbed the frozen road toward Blackthorn Castle, its wheels groaning through 6 inches of snow and old ice. The November wind came down from the Vermont mountains like a warning, rattling the black pines on both sides of the road and pushing thin white dust across the glass. She sat very still in her plain ivory wedding dress, the hem damp from the station platform, her gloved hands folded over a small travel bag that held everything she owned. There had been no wedding breakfast, no music, no laughing guests throwing rice into the cold air. There had only been a judge in a quiet county office, a signature beside hers, and the tall, unsmiling man who became her husband without once looking as if the word meant anything to him. Duke Alexander Whitmore had stood beside her like a carved figure of winter itself, broad-shouldered in a dark coat, his face pale and composed, his gray eyes fixed on some distant grief no one else could see. When the ceremony ended, he had not touched her hand. He had only said, "Blackthorn will provide what is necessary," and then ridden ahead with his steward, leaving Clara to follow in a separate carriage like a parcel sent to the wrong address. By the time the castle appeared, the sky had turned the color of iron. Blackthorn rose from the mountain ridge in jagged towers and dark stone, its narrow windows glowing faintly here and there, as if the house had forgotten how to welcome anyone. It was larger than Clara had imagined and colder than any place she had ever seen. Not simply cold in temperature, though the wind cut through her cloak and made her breath bloom white before her lips. It was cold in spirit, cold in the way the front doors opened without haste, cold in the way the servants lowered their eyes, cold in the way no one said, "Welcome home." An elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Vale met her in the entrance hall beneath a chandelier of dim candles. Behind the woman, a grand staircase climbed into shadow, and above it hung a portrait covered in black velvet. Clara's eyes lifted toward it for only a second before Mrs. Vale stepped into her line of sight. "His Grace has retired to the West Tower," the housekeeper said. "He left instructions." Clara waited, her fingers tightening around the handle of her bag. "You are to be given the East Wing." A flicker passed through the nearest footman's face, quickly hidden. Mrs. Vale continued in the same flat voice. "No fires after midnight. No rooms are to be opened without permission. His Grace does not dine in company. Breakfast will be brought to your door. No fires after midnight. No husband. No welcome." Clara swallowed the small ache rising in her throat and nodded with the dignity her father had taught her to keep even when her pockets were empty. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale." The East Wing lay at the end of a corridor so long that the candle in the housekeeper's hand seemed to shrink with every step. Dust softened the edges of old frames. White sheets covered furniture like sleeping ghosts. The air smelled of stone, ash, and rooms that had not heard laughter in years. At last Mrs. Vale opened a narrow bedroom where one candle burned on a writing desk beside a hard loaf of bread, a folded blanket, and a single iron key. "This will be your chamber, Your Grace," she said, though the title sounded more like a warning than respect. Then she left. Clara stood alone while the silence gathered around her. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the debt that had brought her here, the father she had buried in spring, the stranger who had married her and abandoned her before supper. Then the wind struck the window, and the candle flame bent nearly flat. Clara crossed the room to pull the torn curtains shut, but her hand stopped on the glass. Beneath the frost, scratched faintly as if by a trembling hand long ago, were words she could barely read. "Do not let this house die with me." Clara's breath caught. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door closed with the final sound of a verdict. She looked at the dying candle, the cold hearth, the untouched bread, and the empty room that had been given to her like a punishment. Then, very slowly, she removed her gloves. "No," she whispered, not to the wind, not to the Duke, but to the sorrow buried inside the walls. "Not tonight." Clara did not sleep that first night in the East Wing. Sleep belonged to people who felt safe enough to close their eyes, and Blackthorn Castle had offered her no such mercy. The candle on the desk burned down slowly, its small flame bending whenever the wind pushed through the cracked window frame. The room held its cold like a secret. It lived in the floorboards, in the stone walls, in the stiff sheets of the narrow bed, in the silver breath that left Clara's lips each time she exhaled. She kept her cloak around her shoulders and sat beside the empty hearth until the clock somewhere in the castle struck 1 in the morning, each chime traveling through the corridors like a footstep from another life. At last, unable to bear the stillness, she rose and took the iron key from the desk. The door opened with a reluctant sigh. Beyond it, the hallway stretched dark and pale beneath its coverings of dust, every piece of furniture draped in white linen, every portrait turned toward the wall. Clara moved carefully, one hand guiding the candle, the other brushing along the cold paneling. She passed a music room with a covered piano, a sitting room where dead flowers still stood in a vase, and a nursery door locked with a brass latch that had been polished by hands too anxious to forget it. Something about that door made her pause. Not fear. Sorrow. The kind of sorrow that did not cry out, because it had lived too long beneath orders. From the far end of the corridor came a sound so soft, she almost mistook it for the wind. A cough. Clara turned. The sound came again, followed by the faint scrape of movement. She followed it to a narrow service room tucked behind a faded tapestry, a place no guest would ever see. Inside, an elderly maid lay curled beneath 2 thin blankets on a cot, her gray hair loose against the pillow, her face damp with fever. A cracked pitcher sat beside her. No fire. No proper quilt. No bell within reach. The woman opened her eyes and tried to sit up. "Your Grace," she whispered, frightened. "Please forgive me. I was told this room was empty." Clara set the candle down at once. "Do not get up. Mrs. Vale will be displeased." "Then Mrs. Vale may be displeased with me." The words surprised Clara with their steadiness. She touched the woman's forehead and felt the heat there, strange and fragile amid so much cold. "What is your name?" "Martha, Your Grace." "Martha, I am going to find coal, water, and something warm." The maid's eyes filled with a panic deeper than illness. "His Grace ordered no fires in this wing after midnight." Clara looked toward the dead hearth, then back at the trembling woman. "His Grace is not the one freezing in this room." She left before courage could fade. Down the corridor, down the back stairs, through passages where the castle seemed to watch her with disapproval, Clara found the main kitchen banked for the night. A few embers glowed under ash in the great stove. She took a coal scuttle, a small pot, a towel, and half a jar of honey from the pantry shelf, moving with quiet urgency rather than stealth. She was not stealing warmth. She was returning it to where it had been forbidden. When she came back, Martha was shivering harder. Clara knelt before the hearth and worked until sparks caught, until orange light opened inside the room like a cautious heart. She warmed water, mixed honey into it, and folded her own spare shawl around the old maid's shoulders. Martha drank with both hands around the cup, tears slipping silently into the wrinkles beside her nose. "No one lights fires here," she murmured. Clara fed another piece of coal to the growing flame. "Then it is fortunate I did not know better." Outside, the snow thickened against the windows. Inside, the fire rose. By dawn, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the east wing chimney for the first time in 7 years. Across the courtyard, in the west tower, Duke Alexander Whitmore stood at his window in a dark robe, untouched tea cooling beside him, his gray eyes fixed on that impossible smoke. His face did not change, but his hand tightened around the curtain until the velvet crushed beneath his fingers. By sunrise, the east wing no longer felt entirely dead. It was not warm, not truly, but the fire in Martha's little service room had changed the air around it, sending a faint breath of life into the corridor. Clara carried the empty cup back to the kitchen herself, her wedding dress hidden beneath a gray wool cloak, her hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. The servants she passed lowered their eyes at first, then looked again, startled by the sight of the new Duchess moving through the back passages with a coal smudge on one glove and no lady's maid behind her. Whispers followed, soft as mice in the walls. She heard them and pretended not to. Dignity, her father had once told her, was not the art of being obeyed. It was the art of remaining whole when no one honored you. In the kitchen, the cook, a broad woman named Mrs. Pike, froze with a floury hand pressed to her apron. "Your Grace, you should not be below stairs." Clara set the cup in the basin. A woman was ill above stairs. Mrs. Pike's expression shifted, not quite approval, not quite fear. Martha should have told someone. Perhaps she did not believe anyone would come. Silence fell heavily over the kitchen. No one corrected her. No one dared agree. Clara looked at the long wooden table, at the baskets of hard rolls, the cooling porridge, the blackened kettle above the stove. "Is there broth?" she asked. "A little." "Then Martha shall have it. And anyone else in the household who is sick or too cold to work properly." Mrs. Pike's eyes widened. "His Grace keeps strict accounts." "Then put it on mine." The cook opened her mouth, perhaps to remind Clara that she owned nothing here except a title spoken with reluctance. But something in Clara's quiet face stopped her. A bowl was filled. A heel of bread was wrapped in cloth. By mid-morning, Clara had returned to the east wing with food, clean linen, and a small bundle of candles. She did not ask permission to sweep the corridor. She did not ask permission to open the curtains where the fabric had rotted from years of neglect. Dust rose in silver clouds when she pulled the first sheet from a chair. Beneath it was dark carved wood, fine and lonely, waiting like a person forgotten in a corner. Room by room, she began. A sitting room first, then the narrow passage outside Martha's door, then a child's reading nook with tiny shelves still holding books whose pages smelled of paper, lavender, and time. Clara touched the spines gently, as if greeting sleeping things. Near noon, a young scullery girl appeared at the threshold, no more than 12 years old, with red hands and anxious brown eyes. She held a broom in one hand. "Mrs. Pike said you might want help, Your Grace." Clara turned, surprised by the tremble in the girl's voice. "What is your name?" "Annie, ma'am." "I mean, Your Grace." "Annie, do you know how to read?" The child looked down. "Not much." Clara glanced at the little shelves, then back at the broom. "Then we shall make an arrangement. You help me bring this wing back to order, and I will help you with 1 page each day." Annie stared as if Clara had offered her a kingdom. "Would His Grace allow that?" Clara's hand rested on the back of the uncovered chair. "His Grace has not forbidden kindness." The girl smiled before she remembered to be afraid. That was how it began. Not with a declaration. Not with a rebellion loud enough to shake the towers. With broth carried to a sick maid. With curtains drawn open. With a child sounding out the first line of an old story while snow pressed against the glass. By late afternoon, firelight glowed in 3 hearths, small but steady, and the east wing smelled faintly of soap, bread, and smoke instead of dust and grief. Clara stood in the corridor with tired hands and an aching back, watching Annie polish a brass handle until it shone. For the first time since she had entered Blackthorn, the silence did not feel empty. Then every servant in sight went still. Clara turned. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood at the far end of the hall, dressed in black, his face pale with restrained fury, his gray eyes moving from the open curtains to the lit hearth, from Annie's frightened curtsy to Clara's soot-marked sleeve. The fire beside her cracked softly. Alexander's voice cut through the warmth like winter through glass. "What have you done?" The servants vanished as if the Duke's voice had extinguished them. Annie fled first, clutching the old primer to her chest. Mrs. Pike appeared at the stairwell, saw Alexander's face, and withdrew without a sound. Even Martha, weak and wrapped in Clara's shawl, lowered her eyes from the service room doorway. In a breath, the corridor belonged only to Clara, Alexander, and the 3 forbidden fires burning like small acts of treason. Clara stood beside the nearest hearth with soot on her sleeve and dust in the hem of her gown. She knew what she must have looked like to him. Not a duchess. Not a wife worthy of portrait halls and silver dinners. A woman who had crossed lines she had not been invited to see. Yet she did not step back. "I found Martha ill," she said. The rooms were colder than the carriage house. I lit the fires. Alexander came closer with measured steps, his polished boots making no sound on the old carpet. The heat from the hearth touched one side of his face, revealing the fatigue beneath his sternness, the shadows under his eyes, the tightness of a man who had slept badly for years and called it discipline. This wing was closed for a reason. "It was not closed," Clara replied softly. "It was abandoned." His jaw tightened. "You arrived yesterday. You know nothing of this house." "I know enough to understand that people live in it." The words settled between them. Too plain to be clever. Too true to be dismissed. Alexander looked toward the sitting room, where the curtains had been opened and pale winter light lay across the floor. His gaze stopped on the little reading nook, the polished brass handle, the chair Clara had uncovered. For a moment his expression changed, not softening, but thinning, as if pain had pressed close to the surface before he forced it down. You had no right to touch these rooms. Perhaps not. Clara folded her hands before her, so he would not see them tremble. But I had the ability to help. I chose not to ignore it. A silence followed, dense and cold. Then he said, "You will put everything back." Clara felt the command like a draft under a door. The fire's out by nightfall. Martha still has a fever. She will be moved. To where? He did not answer. Clara studied him. This man who could command every stone at Blackthorn, yet seemed powerless before one corridor of open curtains. "Your Grace," she said, carefully, "a room can mourn, but it should not be buried alive." Alexander's eyes moved sharply to hers. The anger in them was real, but beneath it something else flickered. Alarm. Recognition. A wound touched by an uninvited hand. "Do not speak to me of mourning." His voice was lower now, more dangerous for its quiet. "You are here because your father's debts required settlement, not because you have earned the privilege of judging my grief." Clara went still. It was the first openly cruel thing he had said to her, and its precision told her it had been chosen to send her back into silence. For one breath, it almost worked. She thought of her father's careful hands, the accounts he could not repair after illness took his strength, the promise she had made beside his bed that she would survive with her dignity intact. She lifted her chin. "Then I will not judge your grief," she said. "But I will not mistake neglect for devotion." The fire cracked. Alexander's face hardened as if the sound itself offended him. He turned from her and strode toward the nursery door at the end of the hall, the one with the polished brass latch. Clara followed before she understood why. "Do not open that," Mrs. Vale's voice suddenly called from behind them, thin with panic. Alexander stopped with his hand inches from the latch. Clara looked from the housekeeper to him and saw, in that instant, that the door was not merely forbidden. It was feared. Alexander touched the brass with 2 fingers, then withdrew as if it had burned him. "This door remains locked," he said. "Always." Clara's eyes fell to the threshold. Beneath it, barely visible in the dust, lay a faded blue ribbon, the kind that might once have tied a child's curtain or marked a page in a nursery book. She bent and picked it up gently. Alexander saw it in her hand. All color left his face. From somewhere beyond the covered portrait in the entrance hall, the great house settled with a long wooden sigh. Clara held the ribbon between them, and for the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Blackthorn looked not cold, but afraid. Alexander did not take the blue ribbon from Clara's hand. He only looked at it, his face stripped of its polished severity for one unguarded moment, as if the small faded thing had opened a door inside him no key should have found. Then the mask returned. "Give it to Mrs. Vale," he said, "and leave this corridor as it was." Clara closed her fingers gently around the ribbon. "As it was." His eyes sharpened. "Yes." She looked past him to the dark nursery door, to the half-cleaned hallway, to Martha watching from her little room with the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, to the place where Annie had been learning letters before fear scattered her. As it was when no one came here? As it was when people were cold and silent and afraid to breathe too loudly? Alexander's mouth tightened, but he did not answer. Clara took one step toward Mrs. Vale and placed the ribbon in the housekeeper's trembling hand. "Nothing living should be preserved in pain," she said softly. Mrs. Vale flinched, not from insult, but from memory. The Duke turned away first. "The fires will remain until Martha can be moved," he said, each word appearing to cost him. "No other rooms are to be opened." It was not permission, not kindness, but it was less than winter. By evening, the servants knew. Not because Alexander announced it, but because the east-wing chimneys continued to breathe smoke into the violet sky. Mrs. Pike sent broth without being asked. Annie returned at dusk with an armful of linen and the old primer hidden beneath it. Martha slept through the night under 2 proper blankets. In the days that followed, Clara obeyed the letter of the Duke's order and challenged its spirit with quiet patience. She opened no locked doors. She touched no covered portraits. But she scrubbed the floors already crossed by living feet. She mended curtains already torn by neglect. She asked the stable boy to bring kindling from the dry shed rather than the wet pile near the wall. She set a small table outside Martha's room with a pitcher of water, clean cups, and a candle that anyone could use without asking whether warmth was allowed. Slowly, the wing changed. Not beautifully at first. Honestly, dust gave way to wood grain. Gray windows admitted thin winter sunlight. The stale air began to smell of soap, coal smoke, and the apple bread Mrs. Pike baked whenever she pretended not to care. Clara found a cracked flower pot in a storage closet and planted rosemary in it from a kitchen cutting. She placed it on the sill near Annie's reading nook, where the child now sounded out sentences each afternoon with grave determination. The bird flew over the field. Annie read, pressing one finger beneath each word. Very good, Clara said. Again, but this time let the bird sound as if it believes in the sky. Annie laughed. The sound was small. It was also the first laugh Clara had heard in Blackthorn Castle. Across the courtyard, Alexander heard it too. He had not meant to pause at the West Tower window. He had not meant to watch the East Wing as though it were a foreign country appearing on his own land. Yet there it was, lit in 3 windows, smoke rising cleanly against the snow, a servant carrying folded blankets without dread, a scullery girl leaving with a book hugged against her chest. The house was betraying him. That was how it felt. For 7 years, Blackthorn had kept his silence faithfully. It had held its breath when he held his. It had kept rooms closed, fires dead, laughter absent. Now this young woman with tired eyes and soot on her cuffs had entered like a match struck in darkness, and the castle was answering her. He hated it. He envied it. He could not look away. On the 5th afternoon, Clara carried a basket of leftover bread and soup jars to the lower gate, where 3 children from the village waited beside their mother, all thin coats and reddened noses. Only until the road's clear, Clara told Mrs. Pike, who had followed her with a disapproving shawl and suspiciously full basket. Of course, Your Grace, the cook said, pretending not to smile. Clara knelt to wrap a scarf around the smallest child, a boy with solemn eyes and boots too large for him. There, she whispered. That should help. The boy looked past her toward the towering castle, then back at her. Are you the lady from the warm wing? Clara's hands stilled. Behind her, unseen until that moment, Alexander stood near the archway in his black coat, the snow catching in his dark hair. The child's words hung in the air, innocent and irreversible. Clara slowly rose. Alexander's gaze met hers. This time, there was no anger ready on his tongue, only a silence deeper than command, and something inside it beginning, unwillingly, to thaw. The boy at the gate never knew what his small sentence had done. He only accepted the scarf, clutched his jar of soup, and hurried after his mother down the snowy road, leaving behind a silence that seemed to ring louder than the chapel bell in the village below. Clara kept her eyes lowered as Mrs. Pike gathered the empty basket and retreated toward the kitchen path with unusual speed. Alexander remained beneath the archway, the black wool of his coat dusted with snow, his expression unreadable. The lady from the warm wing. No title had ever sounded less formal. None had ever struck him more deeply. Clara expected rebuke. She expected another command wrapped in frost. Instead, he looked toward the east wing windows where firelight trembled behind clean glass, and his voice, when it came, was quiet. You give away food from my stores now. Clara turned to him fully. Only what would have hardened by morning. And scarves. That one was mine. His gaze dropped briefly to her bare throat, where the wind had already touched the skin above her collar. There was no softness in the look, yet it did not feel cold. It felt interrupted. You should not stand outside without it. Neither should children. A faint movement crossed his face, almost a smile, almost pain, gone before it could become either. You answer as if every matter is simple. No, Clara said. I answer as if some matters are. Before Alexander could reply, carriage wheels sounded beyond the outer drive, sharp and elegant against the packed snow. 2 black horses swept through the gate, pulling a polished sleigh carriage trimmed in silver. Mrs. Vale appeared at the entrance as if summoned by dread. Alexander's expression closed at once. My mother, he said. The words were not explanation. They were weather. Duchess Margaret Whitmore entered Blackthorn as though the castle had been waiting for correction. Tall, pale, and severe beneath a sable-trimmed cloak, she carried age like a weapon polished by discipline. Beside her stepped Vanessa Caldwell, wrapped in cream wool and pearls, golden hair pinned beneath a velvet hat, her beauty bright enough to seem almost rehearsed. Clara knew her name before anyone spoke it. Some women entered a room. Vanessa entered as a verdict. Alexander, Duchess Margaret said, offering her son a gloved cheek. I came as soon as I heard the smoke. Her eyes moved to Clara with careful slowness. and to meet the young woman who has made herself so visible. Alexander's jaw tightened. "This is Clara, your wife," Clara said gently. Duchess Margaret's lips curved, but the smile did not warm her face. "Legally, yes." Vanessa lowered her lashes in a graceful curtsy. "Your Grace, I hope Blackthorn has not overwhelmed you. It can be a difficult house for those unaccustomed to its history." Clara returned the curtsy with calm precision. "Difficult houses often need patience. Or restraint," Margaret said. That evening, a formal dinner was ordered for the first time since Clara's arrival. The dining room blazed with candles, though none seemed to soften the dark portraits lining the walls. Clara wore her only suitable gown, a deep blue dress carefully brushed and mended at the cuff. Across from her, Vanessa shone in silk the color of fresh cream. Margaret sat at the head of the table as if Clara's place had never existed. Alexander was silent through the soup, silent through the roast, silent while Vanessa praised the old days when Blackthorn hosted senators, judges, railroad men, and families whose names belonged on buildings. Then Vanessa tilted her head with a sweetness too delicate to trust. "I admire your courage, Clara. Many women would feel embarrassed. Stepping into such a position after family deaths made the arrangement necessary." The silver fork in Clara's hand stilled. Around the table, even the candles seemed to hold their breath. Margaret added, "Gratitude is a useful virtue in such circumstances. So is remembering the difference between being brought into a house and belonging to it." Clara looked at Alexander. Not pleading, not accusing, only waiting. He stared at the wineglass beside his plate, his face set in stone. 1 second passed, then another. The silence became its own answer. Clara placed her napkin beside her plate with great care. "Forgive me," she said, her voice low and steady. "I mistook shelter for a home." She rose before her tears could humiliate her, though none had fallen, and crossed the long room alone. Behind her, no chair moved. No voice called her back. Only when the door closed did Alexander lift his eyes, and by then the place where she had sat already looked colder than before. Clara did not go to the east wing first. Pride carried her past it, past the rooms she had warmed with her own hands, past the reading nook where Annie had left the primer open to a page about birds and fields and impossible skies. She walked instead to the small chamber that had been given to her on the first night, closed the door softly, and stood very still in the dark. Only then did she let her breath break. Not loudly, not with the drama Vanessa might have enjoyed or Duchess Margaret might have condemned. Clara had learned long ago that some griefs must be held like candles in a draught, shielded carefully, because the world is always ready to blow them out and call the darkness proper. She removed the blue gown, folded it over the chair, and took from her travel bag the only thing she had not shown anyone at Blackthorn, her father's old pocket watch. Its silver case was scratched, its chain worn smooth where his thumb had worried it during years of accounts, illness, and sleepless loyalty. Clara pressed it to her palm. "I tried," she whispered. The watch did not answer. It only ticked faintly, stubbornly, as if time itself refused to pity her. Near midnight, after the castle had settled into its usual uneasy silence, Alexander came to the east wing. He did not know why he went there. Anger would have taken him to his study. Pride would have kept him at the dinner table. Habit would have locked him in the west tower with a glass untouched beside his hand. But something else moved him, something quieter and more difficult to command. He found the corridor lit by one low lamp. The fires had been banked safely for the night. Martha's medicine stood labeled on the small table. A folded note listed which windows still needed repair before the next storm. Another note, in Clara's neat hand, reminded Mrs. Pike that Annie could read 5 new words and should be praised, not teased. Alexander stood before those small evidences of care with a tightening in his throat he refused to name. This was not conquest. It was not ambition. Clara had not taken over his house. She had listened to where it hurt and answered with bread, coal, linen, and patience. On the writing desk in her chamber, the pocket watch caught the lamplight. Alexander knew he should not touch it, yet recognition struck before manners could stop him. He had seen that watch before, not in Clara's hand. In the hand of Thomas Bennet, the old estate keeper who had served Blackthorn before vanishing from its records after the winter Evelyn died. Alexander picked it up slowly. The backplate was loose. When his thumb brushed the hinge, it opened, and a folded paper slipped into his palm, browned with age and sealed with wax that had cracked long ago. His name was written across it in Thomas Bennet's careful hand. Alexander unfolded it with a dread so complete it felt almost peaceful. Your Grace, if this letter reaches you, then I failed to speak while courage might still have mattered. Her Grace Evelyn did not fall into despair as they told you. She was frightened, yes, but not of the house, and not of you. She was frightened of the Caldwell accounts, of signatures copied, of land transfers hidden behind charity ledgers. Miss Vanessa's father pressed her to approve what she would not approve. I heard enough to know the truth was being buried under manners and money. I tried to bring proof to your mother, but I was dismissed before dawn and warned that my daughter would suffer if I returned. I have carried that shame every year since. If my Clara ever comes to Blackthorn, do not leave her in the cold. She will be the only honest soul in that house. Alexander read the final line once. Then again, the room seemed to tilt around him. Caldwell, Vanessa, the covered portrait, the locked nursery, the years he had spent blaming grief, blaming himself, blaming the weakness of a heart that had loved and failed to protect. All while truth had waited inside a poor man's watch, ticking patiently through winter after winter. Footsteps sounded behind him. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in her plain gray cloak, her face pale but composed. Her eyes moved from the open watch to the letter in his hand. For the first time, Alexander had no command ready, no defense, no eye strong enough. Clara, he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, less like duty, more like a prayer he had forgotten how to say. She looked at the letter, then at him. My father said Blackthorn would need the truth one day. Alexander's fingers closed around the paper, not crushing it, but holding it as if it might be the last honest thing left to him. Down the corridor, the nursery door waited in silence. And for the first time in 7 years, he understood that it had not been locked to protect the dead. It had been locked to protect the guilty. Clara did not ask Alexander what he would do with the letter. She already knew the answer would matter less than the silence that followed it. A man could discover the truth and still choose the comfort of denial. A duke could hold proof in his hand and still protect the name of a family that had dined at his table. So she took the pocket watch from him gently, closed the silver case, and slipped it into her cloak. My father carried shame that was never his, she said. I will not carry yours. Alexander looked at her as if the words had struck something deeper than anger. Clara, you should not leave this room tonight. No, she answered softly. I should not have been left in it. There was no bitterness in her voice. That made it worse. Bitterness would have given him something to resist. Her calm gave him only truth. Before dawn, while Blackthorn slept beneath a fresh fall of snow, Clara packed her small travel bag. She left the blue gown folded on the chair, the rosemary pot on Annie's reading table, and a note for Mrs. Pike asking that Martha be given broth before noon. On the window ledge, where frost feathered the glass, she placed her wedding ring. Not thrown down, not hidden, set with care, as one sets down a candle that has burned as long as it can. Then she walked out through the servants' passage, wrapped in her gray cloak, carrying her father's watch against her heart. The road to the old Bennett cottage was nearly 2 miles through pine woods and open drifts. Clara knew the way from childhood visits with her father, back when Blackthorn had still sounded to her like a place of bells, horses, and distant grandeur. Now the castle behind her looked like a dark shape half buried in its own regret. The wind rose before she reached the lower bridge. Snow thickened, soft at first, then hard enough to blur the world into white. She kept walking. Back at Blackthorn, Alexander found the ring just after sunrise. For several seconds he did not move. The little circle of gold lay on the sill beside a trace of melted frost, impossibly small, impossibly final. Behind him, Annie stood in the doorway with the primer in her arms. Your Grace, she whispered, Mrs. Clara is gone. Mrs. Clara, not the Duchess, not the arrangement. The woman who had taught a servant child to make words sound like wings. Alexander closed his hand around the ring and turned so quickly that Annie stepped back. By the time he reached the dining room, Duchess Margaret and Vanessa were already at breakfast, silver and china arranged between them like a fortress. Where is she? Alexander asked. Margaret did not look up from her tea. If your wife has chosen to withdraw, perhaps it is best to allow dignity to settle over the matter. Vanessa's smile trembled at the edges. She seemed unhappy here. Some women are not suited to great houses. Alexander placed Thomas Bennett's letter on the table. The paper made almost no sound, yet Vanessa's face lost its color. "Read it," he said. Margaret's hand froze above her cup. "Alexander, this is hardly appropriate before servants." "Then let them hear what was hidden from them." Mrs. Vale stood near the sideboard, pale as wax. Mrs. Pike stopped in the doorway. Even the footmen grew still. Alexander read the letter aloud, his voice low and steady, until the names Caldwell and Evelyn hung in the room like smoke that could no longer be forced back into the chimney. Vanessa rose too quickly. "That is the writing of a dismissed servant. A bitter man. Surely you would not insult my family because of some old accusation." Alexander looked at her. "I have not mentioned your father's private ledgers." Vanessa's lips parted. "Those ledgers were burned after Evelyn signed nothing." Silence. Her own sentence seemed to reach her a second too late. Margaret closed her eyes. Mrs. Vale pressed a hand to her mouth. Alexander did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Evelyn never signed anything. The letter did not say she did. Vanessa gripped the back of her chair, all cream silk and exposed fear. Outside, the storm struck the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Alexander turned from her before she could speak again. "Have the horse saddled." Margaret stood. "In this weather, you will not reach anyone." He looked once toward the east wing, where the fires still burned because Clara had taught the house to keep breathing. "I am not reaching anyone," he said. "I am bringing my wife home." The Bennett cottage stood at the edge of the old maple grove, its roof bent under snow, its windows glowing faintly with a stubborn orange light. When Alexander arrived, his coat was white with frost, and his breath came hard from the ride. Through the small window, he saw Clara kneeling by the hearth, feeding the last pieces of a broken chair into the flames while a lost village boy slept beneath her cloak and an elderly woman warmed her hands nearby. Even after leaving him, even after humiliation, even after the cold he had given her, she was still making shelter. He knocked once and entered only when she turned. Clara's face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. Alexander removed his hat as if stepping into a chapel. "Clara," he said. She looked at the snow on his shoulders, the ring in his open palm, the grief that had finally stopped pretending to be pride. "I did not leave because it was cold, Your Grace," she said. "I left because I was tired of being the only one trying to make it warm." Alexander bowed his head, and outside the storm went on, but inside the little cottage, before her quiet fire, the Duke had no winter left to hide behind. Alexander did not ask Clara to forgive him in the cottage. Forgiveness was not a coat to be handed over because a man had finally noticed the cold. He stood beside the small hearth while the village boy slept beneath Clara's cloak and the elderly woman sipped warm water from a chipped cup, and for the first time in 7 years, the Duke of Blackthorn understood the difference between command and care. "The roads are closing," Clara said, her voice tired but steady. "They cannot walk back tonight." Alexander looked at the broken chair feeding the fire, then at the roof beams darkened by age, then at Clara's hands, red from cold and work. "Then they will not walk." He removed his own heavy coat and laid it over the sleeping child without ceremony. "My sleigh is outside. I will take all of you to Blackthorn." The old woman stared at him as though stone had spoken kindly. Clara did not move. "And when we arrive?" He opened his hand. Her ring rested in his palm, small and bright against the lines of his skin. "When we arrive, you will enter through the front doors, or I will not enter at all." The journey back took nearly an hour, the sleigh moving carefully through snow that rose in white banks along the road. Clara sat opposite Alexander with the child between them and the old woman wrapped in blankets beside her. No grand apology filled the dark. Only the hiss of runners over ice, the breathing of tired horses, and now and then Alexander's hand reaching to secure the blanket around those who needed warmth more than pride. When Blackthorn appeared through the storm, every window in the east wing was lit. Someone had kept the fires burning. Mrs. Pike stood at the entrance with Annie, Martha, and half the household gathered behind her. Duchess Margaret waited near the staircase, rigid with disbelief. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Vale stood apart, holding the faded blue ribbon in both hands like a confession. Alexander stepped down first, then offered Clara his hand. This time it was not a gesture of ownership. It was a choice made in front of witnesses. Clara looked at it for one long breath before placing her gloved fingers in his. Together, they crossed the threshold. No one spoke until they reached the great hall beneath the veiled portrait. Alexander turned to the servants, to his mother, to the woman who had been abandoned in his house and had somehow taught it to breathe. "Mrs. Bennet is not here by debt," he said. "She is not here by mistake, charity, or convenience. She is my wife, the Duchess of Blackthorn, and the only person in this house brave enough to treat the living as though they mattered." Margaret's face tightened. "Alexander, think carefully. I am thinking clearly for the first time in years." He looked toward Mrs. Vale. "The East Wing will remain open. The Caldwell accounts will be given to council in Burlington by morning. Any servant who was silenced will be heard without fear. And my mother will no longer govern this household in the name of grief." The words fell gently, but they changed the house more than shouting ever could. Mrs. Vale began to cry without sound. Annie smiled openly. Martha bowed her head. Clara stood very still, not triumphant, not softened into surrender, but seen. At last, Alexander turned to the black-veiled portrait. His hand paused only once before he drew the cloth away. Duchess Evelyn's painted face looked down from the wall, young and sorrowful, but no longer hidden. For a moment, the hall held its breath. Then Alexander bowed his head to the portrait, not as a prisoner bowing to the past, but as a man releasing it. "Rest now," he whispered. Clara heard him, and something in her eyes gentled, though she did not reach for him. Not yet. Trust would not bloom in a single night. It would have to be tended, like rosemary on a winter windowsill, like fire coaxed from ash, like a house taught slowly to become a home. Weeks passed. The locked nursery became a reading room for the village children. The East Wing was renamed the Warm Wing by no decree at all, but because everyone called it that until the name became true. Mrs. Pike sent soup twice a week to families snowed in beyond the lower road. Annie read entire pages without fear. Martha recovered by the fire she had once been forbidden to light. And Alexander learned the humblest duties of love, carrying coal before being asked, listening without defending himself, waiting beside Clara in silence until silence no longer hurt. One evening in late December, snow fell softly beyond the clean windows, and Clara stood in the warm wing with a child asleep against her shoulder, the fire painting gold across her hair. Alexander paused in the doorway, no longer the master of a frozen castle, but a man grateful to be allowed inside the warmth she had made. Clara looked over at him, and this time her smile was small, tired, and real. Some castles are not saved by power, nor by wealth, nor by names carved above ancient doors. Some are saved by quiet hands, honest hearts, and the courage to stop worshiping the cold.